Hello, Ben from Back Photography here, and today we're looking at a portrait shoot I did with a client of mine, Kayla, in Belair National Park in Adelaide, South Australia. The day we were shooting was a really great day for portraits because there were plenty of clouds in the sky that were masking the really harsh sunlight that normally comes through during the day. So we were getting some really flat images, and by flat I mean there wasn't any harsh highlights or shadows to be seen anywhere on the scene, which is what you want when it comes to portraits, at least in my opinion. So the photo I'll be showing you guys today was shot at an aperture of f2, a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second, at an ISO of 125. And the gear I used was my trusty Sony a7R II camera body. Matched to that was a Sigma 50mm 1.4. This is the non-art edition, so it's like the old-fashioned version of this lens. And I used natural light, so there wasn't any light modifiers, there wasn't any reflectors or anything like that. So the reason I shot at an aperture of f2 was I really wanted to draw focus to the subject and blur out any distractions that there were in the background. And the lower you have your aperture set, the blurrier your background is going to be in contrast to your subject. So f2 is quite a low aperture, but some lenses go lower to 1.8. This lens goes down to 1.4. Some lenses even go down to 1.2 and even lower than that sometimes. Some of the old Leica lenses and Mitakon lenses these days go down to a whopping f0.95. But for this shoot, f2 was low enough for me to really blow out the background completely and draw focus completely to my subject, which was Kayla. The reason I chose a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second is because that is a shutter speed I'm comfortable with getting sharp images from, because any lower than 1/200th and you start having to think about camera shake and making sure your model doesn't move around while you're taking photos. And that allowed me to use a really low ISO, which meant that I could get the best quality image from my camera. So the higher your ISO is when you take a photo, as a general rule, the noisier and grainier your photo will be, so it's always best to shoot at a lower ISO. In general, there are a few exceptions, like when you're talking about astrophotography and things like that, but when it comes to portraits, if you can shoot at a lower ISO, then that's normally going to produce a better result. So when I'm shooting portraits, and really when I'm shooting any style of photography, I want my subject to be in a position where the ambient light on them and around them is all a very consistent power. And what I mean by that is, no part of their body or face is a lot brighter than any other part. The reason I like doing that is because what I find is that cameras struggle with the most is dynamic range. And if everything is the same exposure, the camera doesn't have to struggle bringing down the highlights or upping the shadows, which gives you a very good starting ground for doing modifications post-production. And if you can get your image looking really good in the camera, by the time you get it in post-production, you're going to have a lot of flexibility in adding highlights, adding shadows, doing corrections and all that sort of thing after you've taken the photo. So let's get started with the editing process I used. First things first, I like to get the color of the model's face perfect before I move on to anything else. So this was just changing highlights, shadows, contrast, clarity, all that sort of stuff, getting the right face colors and tones before I move on to anything else. Then the second thing I did, after I've changed all those settings, everything else is kind of messed up. So just adding some extra color back into the hair to make it look more normal and natural. Kayla's hair was a really nice brown color, so I was just trying to add that tone back into her hair there, and I reckon it looks pretty good. So I just reset the brush tool and then added a little bit more darkness to the top of the hair where it was still looking a little bit grey, and then a little bit more to the sides as well, and I reckon that looks pretty good. So the next thing I did was just made the eyes pop a little bit by adding some extra clarity and also bumping the exposure up slightly as well. Adding a little bit of extra saturation as well, just to make the irises pop. Looks pretty nice. So next thing, I just like to pretty much max out blacks, max out exposure as sort of a placeholder to see which parts I'm selecting. And at the moment I'm just selecting all of her skin, which is looking a little bit bumpy in places. Didn't do much on the nose just because that was already looking quite smooth. And once I'd selected all of that stuff, pretty much the next step is just to remove those two black bits and then reduce the clarity to a nice smooth tone. Try not to make the model look like a porcelain doll, but just add a little bit of reduction in clarity to smooth out the skin tones. Now I'm not quite happy with the skin tones again, so I've just gone to the hue tool and made sure I have them the way I like, and that looks pretty good, I reckon. Okay, yeah, that looks pretty good. Next step is to push it into Photoshop. And now we're just going to select Kayla and then inverse the selection and add a little bit of a blur to the background. Even though it's quite blurry already, it does just make the blur a little bit more accentuated while keeping her whole face sharp. Next thing I did was just pull in her cheeks a little bit. She did ask for me to do a bit of a model treatment on her, so I made her eyes a little bit bigger as well as making her face just a little bit slimmer. Yep, that looks really good. Cool, so the next step is I just moved in her stomach a little bit just because she asked me to remove that little bump and also just sort of beautify her a little bit in general. And then the next step I did was just removing all the little blemishes from her skin. There wasn't that much to do really, her skin was actually pretty good. There was a little bit of bumpiness just on the T section of her head, which I ended up using a Gaussian blur just to get rid of that little bit there. Yep, that's it, just that little 1 or 2 pixel blur just to sort of smooth out the skin tones there. Then just removing any little blemishes left on her face, that looks pretty good. So that label there was looking a little bit distracting in the image, so I just decided to use the Content Aware Deletion tool and get rid of that. It's a pretty awesome tool, you can delete pretty much anything, as long as the area that you're deleting isn't too busy. It actually works really well. So Kayla had a little bit of a birthmark on her chest and she'd asked me to get rid of that as well for the photo, so I just used the clone stamp and also the patch tool just to get rid of the little birthmark blemishes. Just cleaning up this area a little bit more, and then the clone stamp tool just to get rid of the little freckles on Kayla's chest. There really wasn't that much to do with the skin, it was all looking quite clear actually. Cool, so I noticed that Kayla's face was a little bit darker than her chest, so I decided to add just 0.1 or 0.2 stops of exposure to her face, and then also a little bit of whites as well, just to sort of make it smooth and blend in with the rest of her skin. After doing that, I decided to also just make the exposure on her chest a little bit lower, just to sort of even out all the colours, all the exposures and all the tones in her face, hands and chest. And that's pretty much the end of the tutorial. And the last thing I did was I just made her smile a little bit more pronounced, just a very slight side smile. Just I thought that expression looked really nice on her face. And that's pretty much the end of the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you found it interesting or learned something, and I hope to see you in the next one.